Greetings, everyone. As you know, our primary reference is the Bible, but we are also continuing in our use of N.T. Wright's text entitled simply Jesus. In this portion of the lecture, we will be discussing pages 131 through 206. And this starts in chapter 11, entitled Space, Time, and Matter. N.T. Wright says that the one thing we can be sure of is that inhabitants of first century Palestine didn't think of space, time, and matter in quite the way that we do. If we're going to understand Jesus, it's vital to grasp the difference between his world and ours. Israel's God was right now becoming king, was taking charge, was establishing his long-awaited saving and healing rule on earth as in heaven. Heaven and earth were being joined up, but no longer in the temple in Jerusalem. The joining place was visible where the healings were taking place, where the party was going on, where forgiveness was happening. In other words, the joining place, the overlapping circle, was taking place where Jesus was and in what he was doing. Jesus was, as it were, a walking temple, a living, breathing place where Israel's God was living. Jesus was the new temple. He continues, Jesus talked about God, but he talked about God precisely in order to explain the things that he himself was doing. So we shouldn't be surprised, he writes, at Jesus' action in the temple. The temple had, as it were, been a great signpost pointing forward to another reality that had lain unnoticed for generations, like the vital clue in a detective story that is only recognized as such in the final chapter. Remember the promise to David that God would build him a house, a family founded on the Son of David, who would be the Son of God. David had wanted to build a house for God, and God had replied that he would build David a house. David's coming son is the ultimate reality. The temple in Jerusalem is the advanced signpost to that reality. Now that the reality is here, the signpost isn't needed anymore. What N.T. Wright is saying is that now that Jesus, the one to whom all of these promises were pointing, the temple is no longer needed. Now one met God in the person of Jesus Christ, no longer in the physical building known as the temple. He continues by saying it gets worse again. The temple had come to symbolize the nationalist movement that had led many Jews to revolt against the pagan oppression in the past, and would lead them to do so once more. He writes, as we see graphically throughout the history of Israel, and not least in the first century, the temple was the sign that Israel's God, the world's creator, was with his people and would defend them against all comers. Battle and temple had gone together for 1,000 years, from David himself through Judah the hammer to Simon the star. These were Jewish revolutionary figures. Judah the hammer was one prior to the time of Jesus, which you can read about in a book of writings called the Maccabees. And Simon the star, another Jewish revolutionary that came some years after Jesus. But in all of these, from David through Judah the hammer to Simon the star, the temple was the symbol for battle. And Jesus had come as the Prince of Peace. If only you'd known, he sobbed out through his tears, on this day, even you, what peace meant. But now it's hidden and you can't see it. Enemies will come, he said. They won't leave one single stone on another, because you didn't know the moment when God was visiting you. Luke 19:42 through 44. God was indeed visiting Israel in the person of Jesus. In In the next section, entitled Time Fulfilled, N.T. Wright continues, but already in the opening of the Bible there is another feature. When God made the world, he rested on the seventh day. This doesn't just mean that God took a day off. It means that in the previous 6 days, God was making a world, heaven and earth together, for his own use. Like someone building a home, God finished the job and then went in to take up residence, to enjoy what he had built. Creation was itself a temple, the heaven and earth structure built for God to live in. And the seventh-day rest was therefore a sign pointing forward into successive ages of time, a forward-looking signpost that said that one day when God's purposes for creation were accomplished, there would be a moment of ultimate completion, a moment when the work would finally be done, and God with his people would take his rest, would enjoy what he had accomplished. Continues and says, the Sabbath was the regular signpost pointing forward to God's promised future. And Jesus was announcing that the future to which the signposts had been pointing had now arrived in the present. So we see God resting on the seventh day in Genesis, taking his rest in his creation, the creation that symbolized the temple, even before the actual temple was built. And N.T. Wright says that the Sabbath rest that we see in Genesis was another signpost that was pointing forward to God's promised future, when at that time God and his people would enter that eternal rest. And Jesus was announcing that the future to which the signpost had been pointing had arrived in the present. That is, Jesus himself had made that promise, that signpost, a reality. In the next section, entitled A New Creation, N.T. Wright says this, the theme of new creation that bubbles up from these stories emerges in our third category, matter. Remember the title, Space, Time, and Matter. He now wants to discuss the subject of matter, which is what he calls reality, the physical world in all its complexity and glory. Here, today's readers of the New Testament have to take an even deeper breath than before. We have been schooled to believe, as a bedrock principle in our worldview, that the material world is relentlessly and reductively subject to the laws of physics, chemistry, and the more specific sciences of astronomy, biology, zoology, botany, and the rest. But as with geography, or space, and chronology, or time, so here also the Jewish worldview begs to differ. That is, just as the Jewish worldview did not understand space in the way that we understand it today, they didn't understand time in the way that we understand it. They also did not understand matter or the physical world the way in which we understand it today. He continues, the world of matter, no less than those of space and time, was made by the Creator God. It was made not only to display his beauty and power, but also as a vessel for his glory. Again and again, the prophets and the Psalms hint at what we might conceivably have guessed from the story of creation itself. The material world was made to be filled with God's glory. The reference he gives is Habakkuk 2:14. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. What prevents us, he asks, from thinking in these terms? N.T. Wright believes there's a long and often unrecognized triumph of the movement we call deism. Deism, defined by N.T. Wright, is a modern version of the ancient philosophy called Epicureanism. As long as we are thinking in that way, with God or the gods as a long way away and earth trundling on entirely by its own steam, we will never glimpse that vision. If we will find it difficult even to understand what it was about. If we do try to believe it, we will be forced to treat it simply as fantasy, a pretty idea rather than a rock-bottom reality. That is the curse of the false idea rather than bedrock or rather than rock bottom reality. That is the curse of the false either or that has been wished on scholarship these many years. Either robust skepticism or grit your teeth conservatism. It's time for both of those false reactions to be confronted by first century reality. What N.T. Wright is trying to say is that this idea of deism, which we saw take root in the 1700s, especially in the West, is just a new version of an ancient philosophy called Epicureanism that says that God is a long ways off. He may have made this stuff we call matter, this earth, but then he sort of disappeared back into the heavens, and he's really nowhere around and has left the world to kind of run on its own. And this is a very dangerous way of understanding. This is not the way that the Bible presents God or his creation. He says, continuing, space-time and now matter. In this last respect, too, the prophetic visions of the ancient scriptures suddenly acquire new dimensions. Jesus' announcement that God is now in charge, that God is becoming king on earth as in heaven, means that we can glimpse something of what this prophetic vision might mean. We can see the material world itself being transformed by the presence and power of Israel's God, the Creator. In other words, the physical creation is not bad. It's good. God created it. It's fallen and is in need of rescue. And that is precisely what Jesus has come to do. Our next section is entitled A New Kind of Revolution. N.T. Wright says, this is on page 144, first, it will not do to suppose that Jesus came to teach people how to get to heaven. That view has been immensely popular in Western Christianity for many generations, but it simply won't do. The whole point of Jesus' public career was not to tell people that God was in heaven and that at death they could leave earth behind and go to be with him there. It was to tell them that God was now taking charge right here on earth, that they should pray for this to happen, that they should recognize in his own work the signs that it was happening indeed, that when he completed his work, it would become a reality. In particular, N.T. Wright says, we must be clear what is and isn't meant when Jesus in Matthew's Gospel speaks about the kingdom of heaven. Many have wrongly assumed that he was referring to a kingdom in the sense of a place called heaven. In other words, a heavenly realm to which people might aspire to go once their time on earth was over. He says that is simply not what the phrase meant in the first century. Within Jesus' world, the word heaven could be a reverent way of saying God. And in any case, part of the point of heaven is that it wasn't detached. It wasn't a long way off, but it was always the place from which earth was to be run. When in the book of Daniel, N.T. Wright says, people speak about the God of heaven, the point is that this God is in charge on earth, not that he's a long way away and unconcerned about it. The God of heaven is precisely the one who organizes things on earth and will eventually set up his kingdom there. On page 146, he says, as we saw earlier, first century Jewish revolutionary movements used God's kingdom as one of their major slogans. They didn't want other rulers. They just wanted God himself to be king. From some points of view, Jesus does indeed look a bit like the figure we discussed briefly, Judah the Hammer, going around with his little band of loyal followers, gathering support, managing to stay out of trouble, and eventually going up to Jerusalem, palm branches waving to cleanse the temple. From some points of view, Jesus even looks like the other figure we discussed briefly, Simon the Star. mounting a 3-year kingdom movement in which the kingdom has indeed already begun, while the great battle and the proper rebuilding of the temple remained in the future. Jesus, like Simon, seems to have practiced and taught a severe way of life in which Israel's ancient law was intensified. For Jesus, anger and lust were as much off limits as murder and adultery. And there are some signs in the Gospels that people were eyeing Jesus during his public ministry to compare him with Herod Antipas. The sources suggest that he was giving his followers instructions on how to behave now that they were living under his rule. There are enough analogies there for us to say that Jesus really does belong on the map of those kingdom movements. We can, he writes, of course see why faced with the Marxist theory, many scholars and preachers have reacted in horror. It won't do to suppose that what Jesus was doing was simply advancing a kind of human revolution. He wasn't a revolution in the same way as these other revolutionaries. It's what N.T. Wright is trying to say. Jesus has plenty of harsh words for the rich, and this is true in the text of the Bible, far more than anyone else. But just as, to the dismay of his own imprisoned cousin, he showed no sign of launching a movement to oust Herod Antipas and set his prisoners free, so he showed no sign either of joining one of the various already existing resistance movements or starting his own. These movements clearly were using the same language as he was, since they too spoke about God becoming king. But what Jesus meant by that acted out in 100 vivid demonstrations of God's sovereign power and explained in 100 parables that told the ancient stories in a new way was quite different from what the ordinary revolutionaries had in mind. So Jesus wasn't a revolutionary in the sense of those like Judah the Hammer or Simon the Star. He wasn't even a socialist revolutionary like Karl Marx and his followers. Jesus was something very different. N.T. Wright says that even when John the Baptist was imprisoned by Herod Antipas, he didn't take soldiers and storm the prison to set him free. Jesus was a revolutionary in a very different way. He continues and says, nor was Jesus simply advocating a clever, philosophically savvy way of living courageously within the present evil world, a way by which his followers might be able to attain some kind of detachment. After the failure of earlier attempts to make Jesus into a Marxist hero, we have seen more subtle attempts to make him a cynic hero, looking out on the follies and failings of the world with an ironic smile and teaching his followers how to rise above it. This is not Jesus either. He's not a cynic. He's not a Marxist. Jesus is something very different. He says on page 148 that Jesus' powerful acts of healing, then together with all the other extraordinary things the Gospels credit him with, are not done in order to prove his divinity. If you see them like that, they prove too much and too little. Too much means that other people had and still have remarkable gifts of healing. That's always been a feature on the edge of religious movements and sometimes in the center of them. But it doesn't mean that the person doing the healing is God just like that. Were that to be the case, there would be quite a lot of gods. Equally, too little, meaning those who have seen Jesus' powerful acts as proof of his divinity, have often just stopped there as though that was the main thing one was supposed to conclude from the reading of the Gospels. They have then allowed the right answer to the question about divinity to shut down the question the Gospels are urgently pressing upon us. Is God becoming king? And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, our 4 Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament, would call the apologist back. The apologist is one who is attempting to provide answers to prove that Christianity is true. He says that these Gospels would call these people, the apologists, back. Sorry, but you've just scored a home run when you should have scored an end run. He says, you're playing the wrong game using a baseball analogy. The Gospels are not about how Jesus turned out to be God. They are about how God became king on earth as in heaven. N.T. Wright, in some of his other works, mentions quite often the Lord's Prayer that we find in Matthew chapter 6. Jesus asked that we pray that the Lord's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And this is precisely what we see in the Gospels. We see that God is becoming king on earth as he already is in heaven. And what we should be asking for is for that same kingdom to be a reality on earth as it already is in heaven. And it is becoming that reality in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Continuing with chapter 12, entitled At the Heart of the Storm, N.T. Wright gives us the first heading of this chapter. It's called Isaiah's Servant. He says this, page 153, first then, the Scriptures. We remind ourselves that the backdrop of all this was the Exodus, with its 7 themes: the tyrant, the leader, the divine victory, sacrifice, vocation, the divine presence, and the promised inheritance. These themes, he says, were reworked at the time of the Babylonian exile and afterwards, producing several key texts. 3 of these stand out in particular. They are linked in many complex ways, but for our present purposes, he says we shall treat them separately. The 3 books, or parts of books, that N.T. Wright believes that Jesus had in mind are Isaiah 40 through 66, Daniel, and Zechariah. Behind and around these stand other books in which similar themes emerge, particularly Ezekiel with its striking picture of covenant renewal, the restoration of Israel after exile, and the return of Israel's God to the restored temple. There are also, of course, the Psalms resonating day by day in the large echo chamber of corporate Jewish memory, and etched in particular into the mind and heart of Jesus himself. Next, we come to chapter 13, entitled, Why Did the Messiah Have to Die? He writes, whatever we say about Jesus, there can be no doubt that his actions and his teaching raised these questions wherever he went. And what are these questions? Well, N.T. Wright gives us in the previous paragraph this. Why are you speaking like this? Are you the one who is to come? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? What sign can you show us? Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? Where did this man get all this wisdom? How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Who are you? Why do you not follow the traditions? Do the authorities think he's the Messiah? Can the Messiah come from Galilee? Why are you behaving unlawfully? Who then is this? Aren't we right to say that you're a Samaritan and have a demon? What do you say about him? By what right are you doing these things? Who is this Son of Man? Should we pay tribute to Caesar? And climactically, are you the King of the Jews? What is truth? Where are you from? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Then finally, too late for answers, but not too late for irony. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us. If you're the Messiah, why don't you come down from the cross? All of these questions were asked about Jesus. And Jesus had his own questions. Who do you say that I am? Do you believe in the Son of Man? Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? How do the scribes say that the Messiah is David's son? Couldn't you keep watch with me for a single hour? And finally and horribly, my God, why did you abandon me? Page 170, our next section entitled The Baptism. N.T. Wright says this: "It is indeed by a river, Israel's principal river, that we glimpse the first of these moments of what he calls triple vocation. John, Jesus' cousin, was baptizing people in the River Jordan. The place, it cannot have been accidental, where the Exodus story reached its goal, and the people their inheritance. Jesus joins the crowds, and as he is baptized, his vocation is confirmed and sharpened by a voice from the heavens: 'You are my Son, you are the one I love. You make me very glad.'" Mark 1:11. That voice, a sudden audible joining of heaven and earth, also provides a sudden joining of the royal vocation of the Messiah, who will rule the nations from his throne in Jerusalem, from Psalm 2, and the servant from Isaiah 42 through 53, who will bring God's justice to the nations through his own obedient suffering. Everything we know about the public career of Jesus indicates that he took that double role as the central shaping of his own sense of vocation. All the signs are that Jesus understood his baptism as the moment when he was anointed, like Israel's kings long ago, for the task. Israel's God was acting through him, in him, as him. The baptism confirmed what Jesus had intuited long before and gave him the moment and the platform from which to launch the kingdom movement through which the saving plan would be accomplished. N.T. Wright is making the point that is at the Jordan River, as we read about going back into the Old Testament, we read in the book of Joshua when the people of Israel finally came out of their wanderings in the wilderness from the Exodus. They crossed the Jordan into their inheritance, into the promised land, and there's no coincidence that John was baptizing in the same river that Jesus was baptized in. There is the echo here of the new Exodus that N.T. Wright has been talking about, combined with the theme of the royal Messiah from Psalm 2 and the suffering servant from Isaiah 53. Yes, he says, people believed that such a figure would rule, bring God's justice to the whole world, and smash the pagans with a rod of iron. That's the royal figure. The servant, yes, the servant would suffer and die. The servant people would bear a heavy load, leading not least to martyrdom. And God himself, Israel's God, would come back to dwell with his people. Devout Jews believed it. That was why it was so important to rebuild or cleanse the temple. Up to this point, these three themes had been separate. Jews who had studied Isaiah 53 had thought of the servant either as a suffering figure, but not as Messiah, or as a Messiah, but not a suffering one. If they thought of the servant as the Messiah, the suffering was reversed, since it was the Messiah's task to inflict the suffering on God's enemies, not to suffer it himself. If they went with the natural flow of the text and saw the servant as a suffering figure, they concluded he couldn't be the Messiah. He would be, whether individually or more likely corporately, the martyr people of God who would in the end be vindicated. And though the scriptures were taken to indicate that Israel's God would work his salvation through these figures, we have no evidence prior to the time of Jesus that anyone supposed that when God returned to his people, he would return as the Messiah or as the servant. Jesus brought these vocations together. When he submitted to John's baptism, expressing the repentance necessary before the great coming restoration and symbolically reenacting the crossing of the Jordan and the entry into the promised land, he identified with his people in their humiliation and penitence and their longing for God's kingdom. This double strand of meaning, sorrow for sin on the one hand, launching the kingdom on the other, points directly to the double meaning of the voice from heaven. The servant vocation and the royal vocation became fused together in his mind and heart. this was what he had to do, and this was the time at which he had to do it. He became in a new and deeper way what he already was. Much as a king's firstborn son, born to rule after his father, would still be anointed for the task when the time came. You are my son, the one I love. Moving forward into the section he calls the crucifixion on page 183, N.T. Wright reminds us that Jesus is executed as the King of the Jews. All four Gospels report that this phrase was written out and nailed above his head on the cross. The Gospel writers, of course, see the sign over Jesus' head as heavily ironic, charged with meaning of which the Roman governor and his soldiers were ignorant. Just as John sees Caiaphas' statement about Jesus dying for the people, Pilate's words point, despite his cynical intention, to the reality the King of the Jews must complete the scripturally rooted vocation by giving his life for his people, for the world, expressing and embodying the saving, healing, sovereign love of Israel's God, the world's creator. Isn't it ironic that the Romans, to be sarcastic, would put the sign over Jesus' head, the King of the Jews, but in reality, that was his very title. Jesus is King. Moving forward to chapter 14, entitled Under New Management, Easter and Beyond. N.T. Wright speaks of what he calls a new world. He says, when Jesus rose from the dead on Easter morning, he rose as the beginning of the new world that Israel's God had always intended to make. You see, not only was Jesus crucified and died on a Roman cross, but the biblical Jesus, the Jesus of the Bible, rose from the dead on the third day. And as N.T. Wright says, he rose as the beginning of the new world that Israel's God had always intended to make. Not only did Jesus die on the cross, not only was he buried, not only was he raised from the dead, but we also know that Jesus is returning one day. Jesus' kingdom, N.T. Wright continues under the section, The Return of Jesus, on 199. It must come by the means that correspond to the message. It's no good announcing love and peace if you make angry, violent war to achieve it. That, as we shall see, is the watchword for the today bit of the story of Jesus. But what about the tomorrow or forever bit? What is the ultimate future? Jesus' first followers were unequivocal. Jesus will return. He will come again. That means that his followers were not ambiguous, that all of the first followers believed, they knew that Jesus will return. He will come again. So there we have the crucifixion, the story of Jesus' ministry, who he was, going through the baptism at the Jordan River, the themes of Isaiah's suffering servant, combined with the theme of the royal Messiah, the royal king of Psalm 2. We see Jesus going to the cross, being crucified as the King of the Jews. We see him being raised again on the third day, on the first Easter. And now we see that he is indeed coming again. Thank you. This concludes our lectures from page 131 to 206.